everyone to the like afternoon session, kind of. It's my pleasure to introduce Aram Bingham. He's going to talk about light and shade on the trees. All yours.
Cool. So thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation, the opportunity to speak, and you all for being here. I originally, I guess, was wondering what to talk about here and wanted to do something alcove related, but then I realized that it's been something of a tradition to have at least one chromatic symmetric function talk here, and that I was well positioned to do that. So that made sense. Also, this is the first one I've been able to attend since I think the first one, which is also where I met the other Aram for the first time virtually. So it's fun to be back here several years later as speakers. But also, as you just mentioned, I realized that it was going to be additionally appropriate given the sponsorship of the Institut TUTTE Institute. And given that Professor TUTTE is one of the granddaddies of graph invariance, which is what the subject of the talk is, but I didn't want to besmirch his name by mispronouncing it and realized that I didn't quite know how to pronounce it correctly. So I thought it would be fun also to see if other people were in the same position. And we were encouraged by the organizers at some point to push the interaction here to the limit. So I made a little survey just to ask people how they think the name is pronounced. I know we have a room full of water loonies here that probably know the answer. So don't give it away quite yet, but maybe we can look at the survey results at the end. And if you get through it, it's one question survey. There is a link to a place where you might be able to suss it out if you're attentive. So the plan here is I'm going to present this question or problem or conjecture about tree isomorphism and chromatic symmetric functions. We're going to try and shed some light on it using unicyclic graphs, and then we're going to throw some shade at it in the sense of being gently disparaging to what sometimes gets called the tree isomorphism conjecture. So if you've been a better attendant to alcove than I have in the past, you can probably safely tune out for the next few minutes while we set things up. But here we go. Also wanted to mention that this came out of a collaboration with these fine people. So this was at an AMS MRC about 2 years ago that we started. This came out of actually a collaboration where there were two groups, and we were the C group for cycle, and there's another Q group that Rosa Jianping and I are also part of, which will hopefully have nice results that we can talk about soon. But this is with these these six of us. Only two of us here were really trying to do the shape of a cycle for the photo, but that is part of what I'll be talking about here. Okay, so the chromatic symmetric functions and the tree isomorphism problem. Tree, of course, being a graph with no cycle. So here are all the trees up to isomorphism on 6 vertices. You can kind of arrange them. At one extreme, you've got paths. At the other, you've got stars down here at the bottom. So one central vertex with just a bunch of leaves coming off. And we're going to start off in graph coloring world. Right, so I'll just remind quickly that a coloring is just an assignment of integers to the vertices, and we're most interested in proper colorings here. So proper just meaning that if you have adjacent vertices, they get different colors. This coloring then is of course not proper because these adjacent vertices both get red, but here is a proper coloring. Right, and classic combinatorial question. How many colorings can you give a graph using just K colors? Goes back to Birkhoff's work on the trying to work towards the 4-color theorem. And there's this function chi g of K, which turns out to be a polynomial, and it is computable using this deletion contraction relation, which is well known. And it is also computable, at least in specific cases, in sort of an ad hoc way where you can just go assigning colors and multiply things together. So maybe we'll just look at this graph here on the right, which is of course a tree. And suppose you just start at this vertex, you have a choice of K colors there, but then once this one is signed, you can only choose K minus 1 of the other colors to assign to the other vertices because it needs to be proper, right? And so neat fact, for any tree on n vertices, the chromatic polynomial always has the same value. It's this thing K times K minus 1 to the n minus 1 here. we're going to take this invariant and just soup it up a little bit. This is a definition going back to this 1995 article of Richard Stanley, introducing the chromatic symmetric function, which is again enumerating proper colorings, but just instead of counting them total, we're going to create a monomial for each one, right? And so this is easiest to see maybe just with an example if you haven't seen it before. If you have this path on 3 vertices, you can think of x1 representing the color red, x2 being the color blue, x3 is green, right? And so this coloring, because I use red once, blue once, green once, that gives me this x1, x2, x3. And here I've used red twice and blue once, so x1 squared, x2, right? And then you add up over all of these proper colorings, and then you see that you have this other coloring that is sort of combinatorially the same as this one. It's just like changing of the names of the colors. And so by adding all these up, you have this action of an infinite symmetric group, and it becomes a symmetric function xg, right? And it is a real generalization of the chromatic polynomial because you can just take this specialization, setting the first k variables to 1 and all the other variables to 0, and you recover the value of the chromatic polynomial. Right, so the big motivating question for the purposes here are just how much graph information does this chromatic symmetric function contain? What can we recover by looking at it? And so in order to approach that, you probably want to know a good way to compute it. And sort of on its face, the way it's computed is using the monomial expansion, right? Because each monomial is corresponding to a proper coloring. But to calculate the monomial expansion, you would really need to actually construct all of the proper colorings, and we'd like to get away from that a little bit. But because it's a symmetric function, and that's a vector space with a lot of nice bases, you can choose whatever basis you want. And so one very nice basis is, of course, the power sum basis. Here's an example if you want it. So, of course, add up all the powers from of your variables to the case power, multiply them together corresponding to the parts of the partition. And Stanley gave this recipe for expanding the chromatic symmetric function in terms of the power sum basis, where you sum over all subsets of the edge set. Right? And you've got this sign, which is corresponding to the, or goes to the size of your edge set. And then this lambda of A is the partition corresponding to the sizes of the connected components on the induced subgraph with those edges A. Okay, so this is a good first way to start getting a handle on this thing. And Stanley, of course, while looking at a number of other things, started pointing in this direction of, okay, what can we extract from this function? Well, we can't always extract the isomorphism type of the graph, right? And so he was quick to give us this first example of graphs which are non-isomorphic but have the same chromatic symmetric function, and pointed out that, okay, this is an example we have, but these are not trees, and so we do not know whether xg distinguishes trees. And this would be very interesting if it did, of course, because all trees have the same chromatic polynomial. But I feel like I should explain here. I put the title of this slide here, not at all to suggest that Richard Stanley is ignorant. I think we all know he's no slouch, especially given that he was here earlier. I don't want that to be the takeaway, but just that the way this question first arose is as just a statement of something that we do not know. But then there's this cultural process where if somebody says something they do not know, sometimes people say, oh, that would be an interesting thing to know. And then it becomes a question, and then people work on it, it becomes a problem. And eventually, if we get good enough evidence for something one way or another, it becomes a conjecture. So sometimes people maybe get a little bit ahead of themselves here and call this the tree isomorphism conjecture or Stanley's tree isomorphism conjecture. But at least as it originally appears, it was just an observation. Okay, so where we're at right now is this object xg doesn't distinguish graphs, but it does tell us a lot more than the chromatic polynomial. And I guess I would also draw your attention to the fact that in this first example, both of these graphs have triangles, which we'll come back again in a little bit. Okay, so light on the trees. Light, some of you may recognize this unicyclic graph here, which is sometimes called a sunlit graph or a sun graph. And light on the trees in the sense that we can learn stuff from about this tree isomorphism problem by studying unicyclic graphs, but also I wanted to illustrate So you've got this sun graph here shining light down on these little unicyclic planets, which are these cycles. And then to these unicyclic planets, we're attaching some number of rooted trees, which I guess I should draw these as green maybe. Right? And that's how we're going to think of constructing our unicyclic graphs. So this parameter of like how many rooted trees are attached to the cycle vertices is a thing we're going to look at in a second. All right. So while XG does not determine the isomorphism type of a graph, it does tell us a bunch of other information. And this is stuff that you can see from the power sum expansion, number of vertices, edges, perfect matchings, triangles, acyclic orientations. The last one even just from the chromatic polynomial. And we have this problem. If we have two non-isomorphic trees, is it true that their chromatic symmetric functions are different? This you can see already. Well, here's an example of a case where they are different. Two non-isomorphic trees that you can distinguish from the chromatic symmetric function actually just from the fact that they have different number of vertices. So you would see that in the degrees, but this has actually been checked a lot more extensively, right? Than this, all the way up to trees on up to 29 vertices through work of Heil and G, which is about 5.5 billion. And this is also interesting, and I think this doesn't get pointed out enough, that really they're not even computing the whole chromatic symmetric function for this result. It's a truncated version where you actually only look at the coefficients in the power sum basis, where you're bounding the part size by 3, I think. So it might be the case if the chromatic symmetric function does distinguish trees that you don't even need to know the whole thing. There might just be some part of it that is enough to tell all the trees apart. Beyond that, we also have a bunch of infinite families of trees that are distinguished by the CSF. So in particular, spiders and different types of caterpillars through a series of papers beginning with Martin Morin and Wagner. And then a variation on that, which is proper Q caterpillars that are basically caterpillars with, instead of leaves, you have paths of length Q attached, but here's a caterpillar, in case you're not familiar with it. What it is just a path, which you think of as the spine of the caterpillar with some number of legs or leaves attached. These two are antennae, but that is one part of the evidence here. Another part of the evidence comes from the stronger version of the tree isomorphism problem, which asks not just does it distinguish, but can you actually reconstruct the trees using the chromatic symmetric function? And this has been shown to be possible for trees with diameter up to at least 5 through work of Rosa Orellana, who's one of our collaborators, and with students and other collaborators of hers, including Jose Aliste Prieto, who I think was a past speaker here, and Edemir and Jose Zamora. Okay, so quick interlude. Before you get excited, how many trees? The answer is not 4. This is just an image of 4 species of trees which happen to exist in what is now Chilean territory. But I'm wondering, or what people think, how many actual trees are there on planet Earth? And there are some stakes here, which is I will send a postcard for whoever comes closest or gets the right answer fastest from Santiago, Chile, to wherever you are in the world. We can work out the details later. But just this image is to encourage you to think how many trees there might be that you haven't actually seen. So don't underestimate. The answer is much more than 4. But each plant counts as 1, according to a reasonably credible source. And I guess I would ask you all to put how many trees you think there are on planet Earth to the nearest 10 billion in the chat. Starting now, you have 30 seconds. No shame, because this is not a number you're supposed to be expected to know. But put your best guess of how many trees on planet Earth starting now. All right, 5 seconds. The stakes are low, just put a number. And we will call it There, Jason's the last guess. Okay, I don't think I see the exact number here, but we can work out who was closest later. The answer should be around 2.94 trillion. Right, so 2,940,000,000,000, which is a lot more than there are trees on 29 vertices even. Right, so maybe that suggests that well, maybe we should hold off on this conjecture until we've gotten to at least the number of trees on planet Earth. But just fun trivia for you. Okay, so instead of trees, right, what I wanted to actually look at was unicyclic graphs. So there's this question of if the CSF distinguishes trees, what is special about them other than obviously being trees, so not having any cycles that makes them distinguishable? And this is a reasonable question because we know that at least when we know we have a tree, there's a bunch more information about the tree we can get. So for instance, you can get the subtree polynomial, which tells you the number of k-vertex subtrees. You can get the number of leaves. You can get the number of paths of a given length, and also this is called the path sequence, or also the degree sequence, and then something called the trunk, or the size of all twigs in more recent work of Logan Krug. Right? So Morin, who was a graduate student, I think at UBC, and then later connected with Martin and Wagner to put this paper together, raised again the question, which actually appears as a statement of ignorance in their article as well, which is like, we do not know whether unicyclic graphs are distinguished. Are they? And it's a little bit too bad they didn't look at this more intensely, because they would have figured out pretty quickly that the answer is no, and there is a very small example with a triangle. And so this example appeared in work of Orellana and Scott around 2014. Right? And so they found this example computationally, but then they turned it into a relation, and then a bunch of examples, or an infinite family of examples of unicyclic graphs or pairs that are non-isomorphic, all of which have a triangle and have the same CSF. All right. So you can see from these examples also that you lose all the information you had from trees, right? So these do not have the same degree sequence. They don't have the same number of leaves. I haven't checked the path sequence or subtrees, but I imagine there's probably examples that where you can find that have the same CSF, but not the same of those two things. But in any case, what we wanted to study for our project was the CSF of unicyclic graphs, where you have cycle size at least 4, right, which hadn't been looked at so much, and figure out what data we can recover in that context. Also, there was a question sort of kicking around in articles of, I think, Krug, Sperkel, and Alicia Preto and Zamora that I'll mention in a bit, that, okay, maybe bipartiteness is something to do with the fact that trees are distinguishable. So this is something we went into this project looking for. And also, with the benefit of hindsight, I'll say, like, okay, here's another interesting question. Does the CSF distinguish unicyclic graphs of a fixed cycle size and number of vertices? Because if you fix cycle size and number of vertices, you also get a collection of graphs that have the same exact chromatic polynomial. Right? So if you can distinguish them with the CSF, you're doing the same thing that the tree isomorphism conjecture, as it were, is purporting to do about trees. Okay. So the tools we use for this, I'm going to mostly skip over this part, but just to mention that there is a very nice basis of symmetric functions that comes from the CSF of star graphs. And then a relation called deletion near contraction, which works on graphs to turn them into star forests, and you can get an expression for the CSF in terms of star forests using these operations that are like deletion contraction, except we have 2 contraction operations that, instead of changing the order of the graph, they keep it preserved. Right? So this appears in work of Alicia Prieto, de Mier, Orellana, Zamora, but I also, in the course of preparing this talk, realized that there's a very similar idea that shows up in work of Sergei Chmutov and a student of his, Shah, from around 2020. There's a talk on YouTube where they do a very similar thing, except they do like squiggle edges instead of these contraction operations, but it's sort of the same idea of expressing CSFs in terms of the star basis. Right? So, but the idea here is like, okay, maybe we can figure out new things by using a different basis. Here's an example of this computation. And here are some of the results that we were able to obtain. First off, recovering some of the things that Martin Moore and Wagner had already figured out, which is that you can get the cycle size. They do a more general thing, which is that you can get the girth. We also, by looking at the hook coefficients, are able to well, you have the number of rooted trees attached to your cycle, the number of internal edges appearing there and interacting. But if you fix one of those parameters, then we can tell what the other one is and sort trees out that way. And we can also recover this parameter R, the number of rooted trees attached, as long as it's between 1 and C, so where C is the cycle size. So there's a little bit of confusion that can happen at R equals 1 and R equals C, but for the most part, we can get that parameter. And then also we can recognize and reconstruct graphs like this so-called cuttlefish graph, of course, with that name because of the family resemblance to these cute sea creatures. There's a whole nice zoological extended metaphor in naming graphs here. And so there's also an idea of proper crabs, which are like caterpillars, but just with a cycle instead of a path, where you just attach a bunch of leaves, and proper meaning that you have leaves on every vertex of the cycle. And then as long as this leaf component sizes are all distinct, then we didn't write this down, but you can do it by the same method as Martin Moore and Wagner of recovering and distinguishing these. Finally, we did a little bit of work giving explicit star expansions for a couple of specific families of graphs, and also looked at bicyclic graphs a little bit and showed that you can recover the cycle size and the number of edges in case those cycles meet along a path, how many edges they have in common. All right. So last, for the shade part, I have these two different kinds of bicyclic graphs playing the role of clouds up here, shading out the trees down below. But yeah, as I said, there's two types of bicyclic graphs. They can either be separated by a path or they can meet along the path. But in either case, that last result, using some linear relations on the star coefficients, we can figure out these three values. Okay, so a fairly classical approach to studying graph invariance, apparently in some sense this goes back to the 1930s at least, is to figure out, okay, if you have a graph invariant in hand, figure out what are the graphs that share that invariant. And I wanted to name a couple of results that are relevant to this section, which goes back to work of Berlovsky, I think, hopefully pronouncing that not too terribly, from 1981, who came up with this invariant called the polychromate. So something that also has to do with coloring, though I couldn't tell you exactly how it's defined. And he described these two graphs called rotor graphs that have the same polychromate. Right? And so these are not obviously non-isomorphic, but they are. And then later, Sarmiento came and showed that the polychromate is equivalent, or contains the same information to something called the U polynomial, described by Noble and Welsh. And then also a bad CSF, which instead of just enumerating over proper colorings, does all colorings and can be specialized to recover the usual CSF. Right, so that means these examples also give us graphs with the same CSF. Going chronologically, Orellana and Scott gave us their family of graphs with triangles and described this modular relation, which was also described in work of Gui Paquet. And their family of examples, which is pictured down here a little bit, it's you take these triangles and then on two sides you put two isomorphic trees. Over here you put two different isomorphic trees. And then if you just swap this edge and turn it into this one over here, you get unicyclic graphs with the triangle with the same CSF, right? This relation, or their triple relation, which is something about triangles, was generalized to a relation about arbitrary size cycles by Dahlberg and van Wilgenberg. I guess I'll skip to this result of Panagia, which is interesting and says that this triple relation actually generates the kernel of a Hopf algebra map from graphs to symmetric functions. So in essence, any two graphs that have the same chromatic symmetric function but are non-isomorphic can be related by a sequence of applications of this modular relation. Also wanted to point out this result, which was the first time we knew examples of graphs with arbitrary girth that have the same CSF. And what they do is they basically take this example up here and show that there's a way to replace all edges by paths of arbitrary lengths, such that you also still have the same CSF, or this bad CSF is also called the TUTTE CSF in their work. But these are the first examples of arbitrary girth, but they do clearly, at least for this case, have a lot of cycles in them. Right. So what we wanted to do is to see if we could do something here with just unicyclic graphs, and first looking at this bipartite property. Right. One other alternative criterion for deciding whether a graph is bipartite is just to say that it has no cycles of odd length. Right. And so this question or statement of ignorance was raised, which is the bipartite property of trees, what makes them distinguishable? And just in this first week of our collaboration at the center in New York State, we found this counterexample just with a computer search, which is two graphs with a 4-cycle on 12 vertices that have the same CSF. Right. And so because it's an even length cycle, of course, this is a bipartite graph, or a pair of bipartite graphs with the same CSF. Also interesting to note that they have the same degree sequence. But the examples here are pretty sparse. Up to 16 vertices, at least, there's only 3 examples of pairs that we could find with 2 with a 4-cycle and 1 with a 5-cycle. And they also all have the same degree sequence, same number of rooted trees attached. And so it seems like a lot of the information that you could get from the CSF in terms of trees is still recoverable, possibly in unicyclic graphs, except that you can still have the same CSF. So this is starting to maybe cast a little bit of doubt on this tree isomorphism conjecture, but there remains, there's a lot of interesting open questions here of we didn't work out the full details of whether you can do things like path sequences or subtrees or generalize the degree sequence in general. Okay, so staring at those few examples that we had, I was more recently able to fit them into an infinite family of unicyclic graphs, or a sequence of pairs with the same CSF. And the construction looks like this. You start with 2 caterpillars, which have all just 1 leaf attached. So I don't know, I think of these as cones. And then you just add 2 edges, one of which is already drawn on either side. And then on the left-hand side, I'm going to add this edge. So from this vertex over to this tooth over here. And on the other side, connect it down here. Right. And you go along like this. And it turns out that, yeah, for every cycle size C, this is a non-isomorphic pair with the same CSF. And so this provides the first, I guess, infinite collection of bipartite graphs with the same CSF, as well as the first arbitrary girth pairs, which are also unicyclic. So in some sense, these are graphs that are as close to trees as possibly could be, or as we've seen so far, that have the same CSF. But on the other hand, you would also maybe hope that something like what Orellana and Scott observed would happen, where these would lead you to new interesting relations for graphs. Unfortunately, at least for me, what I've been able to do is nothing like that at all. It's just sort of a tedious computation applying their modular relation again and again and again until you get kind of a nasty formula for each side, which at least is the same. So this is where, at least for me, this feels like, okay, it's not a pretty proof, but it might be the right proof, because it can be the case where you just have graphs that are very close in terms of differing by a small number of edges, but figuring out that they have the same CSF might be kind of a hairy process, which personally at least leaves open more likely the possibility that there are trees still hiding out there somewhere with larger number of vertices with the same CSF. So with that, I will stop and thank you for your attention. Just mention that I put a link to these slides and also this preprint which has appeared, and I just put a little unpolished manuscript, which is not quite ready for archive, but gives an idea of the computation here on my website if you want to check it out. But yeah, with that, I'll stop. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Aram. Before starting the question, just to let you know, there has been a little bit of discussion about some quasi-symmetric version of this and things like that.
Yeah.
In the chat, so you can take a look at it if we don't have time. So
Okay.
we have time for
Sure.
a question if someone has any. Oh, also that was the one that I think was closer to the number of trees. She said 3 trillion.
Oh yeah, somebody won that. Was it Denai?
Yeah, I think so.
So you guys, okay, great. I will connect with her later and
Very exciting.
get her coordinates.
Thanks.
Someone unmuted themselves. I think they wanted to ask a question.
Yes. So when you showed the examples of the new construction where you connected like those, can you go back to the slide?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, here. Is there any reason why you couldn't just delete the stuff on the right-hand side? Because pretty sure that results in the same degree sequence pair for the two. So what is it about the fact that you still need the vertices on the right to make the CSFs equal? Is there an intuitive explanation? Like in the proof using the modular relation, like did you have to use any vertices on the right-hand side beyond the one right to the right of the middle?
Yeah, I guess I don't know what I can say to that is at least I tried to exploit that somehow and sort of chop the graph up into to break off those component or the subgraphs that they have that are isomorphic using the DNC relation or using the triple relation or even the Dahlberg-Van Willigenberg relation. And I couldn't get anything else to come out cleanly. So was sort of forced to do this lengthy process of sort of shuffling leaves around until I could get to a collection of the same graphs that give an expression for each CSF.
Right, that is very interesting.
Yeah, but yeah, I don't know. I would be curious to throw this to other people also to see if they can maybe find a quicker way to
All right, thank you.
The identity. Sure.
Okay, if that's it, let's thanks Aram again.